My name is Emma, and I am 45 years old. From where I stand, on the stone veranda of what was once the Baron's great manor, I can see the entire valley of Viridia spread out before me. The hills are no longer laced with the orderly green lines of vineyards. Instead, they are a patchwork of deep green pastures, dotted with the white and brown shapes of dairy goats, their bells chiming faintly on the breeze. This view, this sound, is the story of my life. It's the story of how a woman pitied for her dirty hands and humble dreams ended up saving the very people who looked down on her. It's a story about cheese, of all things, and how it became the sweetest, most unexpected revenge. I never thought the day would come when Baroness Isadora von Hessler, a woman who seemed born to wear silk and command respect, would stand before me, her pride in tatters, asking me, the lowly cheesemaker, to save her world. Before I dive into how a devastating blight and a unique blue cheese completely upended the social order of this valley, I want to connect with all of you watching. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. It's incredible to think how far stories can travel. And if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had a dream that others called foolish or small, do me a favor and hit that like button. For those of you who are new here and believe in the power of a quiet underdog, consider subscribing to join our community. It means the world to know we're not alone in these journeys. Now, let's go back 15 years, to a time when the pity of this town felt like a physical weight on my shoulders. 15 years ago, the world of Viridia was wine. It was the blood and soul of the valley. Life revolved around the seasons of the grape, the pruning, the budding, the harvest. And at the center of that world was the Hessler family, and their sprawling vineyards that climbed the hillsides like a conquering army. I was 25, and so was Isadora. We had grown up together, orbiting each other in the way girls do in small towns, a friendship that was always tinged with a sharp, unspoken rivalry. Isadora was like a perfect grape herself, flawless skin, a bright, intoxicating presence, and destined for a grand vintage. She was all sharp angles and glittering ambition, her eyes always fixed on a horizon far beyond our small valley. I was different, quieter. My hands were always stained with something: garden soil, berry juice, ink from the books I devoured. I found my magic in the earth, in the transformation of simple things into something wonderful. Our paths diverged sharply when a distant great-aunt passed away, leaving us both a small, identical inheritance. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to be a beginning. The town buzzed with speculation. What would the two most talked about young women of Oakhaven do with their little windfalls? Isadora's choice was predictable, and to the town, utterly sensible. She invested in herself. She bought exquisite gowns of silk and velvet, traveled to the capital, and attended the kinds of balls and soirees that we only read about in papers. Her inheritance was bait, cast into the glittering social ponds of the aristocracy. The townspeople nodded in approval. "She's a smart one, that Isadora," they'd murmur at the baker's shop. My choice, on the other hand, was met with baffled silence, followed by a wave of gentle, condescending pity. I took my inheritance and bought the old Miller place, a derelict dairy farm on the damp northern edge of the valley that everyone else considered useless. It had a leaky barn, fields choked with thistle, and a damp, mossy cave carved into the hillside behind it. With the money left over, I didn't buy a new dress. I bought 12 Saanen goats, a rare breed known for the high butterfat content of their milk. To the people of Viridia, who understood the noble grape, this was lunacy. I was trading a potential future of comfort and status for a life of mud, animal smells, and manual labor. The pity was a suffocating blanket. "Poor Emma," I'd hear whispered as I passed in the market, my boots caked with mud. She always was a strange one, such a waste. The pity became acute, almost unbearable, the day Isadora's investment paid off. She married Baron Friedrich von Hessler. The wedding was an event the valley would speak of for years. The ancient stone chapel was draped in white roses, and the guest list was a roll call of regional nobility. I went, of course. Not going would have been a more conspicuous statement than attending. I wore my one good dress, a simple blue linen that felt woefully inadequate amongst the silks and jewels. I stood at the back, feeling the collective gaze of the town on me, their thoughts as loud as the organ music. "There's Emma. Look at her. Her rival is becoming a baroness, and she's mucking out a barn. After the ceremony, during the lavish reception at the Hessler estate, Isadora glided through the crowd, a vision in white lace, her arm linked with her baron's. She saw me and made a beeline, her smile a perfect, polished weapon. She stopped before me, her eyes sweeping over my simple dress, my work-roughened hands. "Emma, darling," she said, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I'm so glad you could come. It's so quaint to see you." She tilted her head, a gesture of feigned concern. "Are you enjoying your little project? Still playing with your goats? How wonderfully rustic." She gave a tinkling laugh. "Do be careful not to get any mud on the marble floors, won't you?" Her words were like tiny, sharp stones thrown at my face. The cluster of people around her chuckled politely. In that moment, I felt so small, so foolish. The shame was hot and prickly, a flush that crept up my neck. I wanted to disappear. I murmured a congratulations and slipped away, escaping the grand house, the pitying eyes, and the scent of roses and expensive perfume. As I walked home under the stars, the distant sound of the orchestra mocking my retreat, something inside me shifted. The hurt was still there, a raw, aching wound. But beneath it, a tiny, hard kernel of resolve began to form. Rustic, I thought, my fists clenching. Playing with goats? Fine. I would play with my goats. I would embrace the mud and the rustic life they pitied me for. And I would create something so wonderful, so undeniably mine, that they would have no choice but to see me, not with pity, but with respect. The tears that streamed down my face on that long walk home were not just tears of humiliation, they were tears of furious, defiant baptism. My lonely little farm was no longer just a project, it was my battleground. The years that followed were the hardest of my life. They were a blur of aching muscles, crushing self-doubt, and the pervasive smell of damp earth and souring milk. The romance of my decision faded with the first winter storm that ripped a section of roof off the barn. I spent a freezing night nailing tarps in place by lantern light, my fingers numb, the goats bleeding miserably below. While Isadora was learning how to manage a household staff and which fork to use for the fish course, I was learning how to birth a stubborn kid at 3 a.m. and how to trim hooves without getting kicked. There were so many days I nearly gave up. I'd sit on an overturned bucket in the middle of the muddy yard, whey staining my trousers, my hair smelling of goat, and I'd think of Isadora in her warm, gilded cage. What am I doing? The thought would circle like a vulture. She was the smart one. I am a fool. My first attempts at cheesemaking were disastrous. I produced batches that were too salty, too acidic, or horrifyingly, developed the wrong kind of mold, turning into foul-smelling, inedible sludge. My small inheritance was dwindling, spent on feed, veterinary bills, and cheesemaking equipment that seemed to mock me with its gleaming, unused potential. The town's pity solidified into a kind of gentle certainty. I was Oakhaven's cautionary tale, the strange girl on the hill who had thrown her life away. My salvation came in the form of a grumpy old man named Gaspard. He lived even further out of town than I did, a recluse who had once been the region's most renowned cheesemaker before the vineyards had bought up all the good pasture land. The older folks whispered that he knew secrets of the trade that were all but lost. Desperate, I bundled up one of my less offensive failures, a crumbly, overly dry wheel of something that was supposed to be a simple chev, and made the trek to his cottage. He answered the door with a scowl, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a sharp, suspicious blue. He looked at the cheese I offered, sniffed it with disdain, and grunted. "This isn't cheese. This is chalk. What do you want?" My voice trembled a little. "I want to learn. I want to make something good." He stared at me for a long time, his gaze so intense it felt like he was weighing my very soul. "Passion is not enough," he finally rasped. "This craft demands patience. It demands humility. It demands that you listen to the milk, to the air, to the land. You think you can learn that from a book?" "No," I said, my voice firmer now. "That's why I'm here." Something in my answer must have satisfied him. He cracked the door open wider. "Fine. Be here tomorrow, at sunrise. And don't bring any more of that chalk." Gaspard became my reluctant, cantankerous mentor. He never praised me, but he taught me everything. He taught me that the cheese wasn't just made in the vat, it started in the pasture. He showed me the wild herbs that grew on my land, thyme, clover, a particular type of wild mint, and explained how their flavors would pass through the goats into the milk, creating a taste profile, a terroir that was unique to my farm. He took me to the damp cave behind the barn, the one I had ignored. He held up a lantern, illuminating walls covered in a tapestry of green and blue molds. "This is not a cellar," he said, his voice filled with a rare reverence. "This is a womb. The air in here, the Penicillium roqueforti that lives on these stones, this is a gift. You cannot manufacture this. You can only be its steward." Under his gruff guidance, I stopped trying to force the cheese to be something it wasn't. I started listening. I learned the rhythm of the curd, the feel of it knitting together in the whey. I learned to control the temperature and humidity in the cave, not with modern machines, but with opening and closing the heavy oak door and using damp cloths. It was a slow, meditative process. Weeks turned into months. I filled the cave with small wheels of cheese, turning them, washing them, tending to them like newborns. Then, one autumn afternoon, Gaspard came to inspect my progress. I had a wheel that I had aged for 90 days. It was veined with a deep, dramatic blue, and the aroma that filled the cave was complex, sharp and earthy, with a faint, sweet note underneath. I was terrified. This was the culmination of everything. I cut a small wedge with a trembling hand and offered it to him. He took it, sniffed it, and examined its texture. Then he placed it in his mouth and closed his eyes. The silence stretched for an eternity. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. Finally, he opened his eyes. He didn't smile, but the hard lines around his mouth softened. He simply nodded. Once. "Good," he said. "Now make more." That single word from that grumpy old man was more validating than 1,000 compliments from the people in town would have been. It was real. I had done it. I had created something, not just edible, but extraordinary. I named it Viridian Blue. I started selling it at a small stall in the weekly farmers market. At first, people were hesitant. Goat cheese was common, but this blue-veined, pungent creation was something else entirely. But one by one, the more adventurous locals tried it. Their eyes would widen in surprise. The flavors were a revelation, a creamy, tangy explosion that finished with the subtle, herby notes of the valley itself. The whispers in town started to change. "Have you tried Emma's cheese?" they'd ask, a note of genuine curiosity replacing the pity. "It's unusual, but it's incredible." I was still the strange girl on the hill, but now my strangeness had a purpose, and it tasted divine. The next few years settled into a rhythm of hard work and quiet satisfaction. The gilded curd, the name I gave my little business, grew steadily. My market stall was no longer a curiosity. It was a destination. I had a line of customers every Saturday morning. Rain or shine, I was able to hire my childhood friend Lena, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp mind for numbers who had been laid off from the accounting office of one of the smaller wineries. She took over my chaotic books and helped me streamline production. We repaired the barn roof properly, expanded the herd, and even built a small charming shop front onto the side of the dairy. I was no longer pitied Emma. I was Emma the cheesemaker. It was a solid, respectable identity. I was a local artisan, a success story on a small scale. My Viridian Blue won a bronze medal at a regional agricultural fair, and the local paper ran a small article about it. I even saw Isadora at the fair. She was there as the Baroness, cutting a ribbon for a new vintage of Hessler wine. She saw me with my medal and gave me a tight, polite smile. "How lovely for you, Emma," she'd said, her tone implying it was a cute little hobby that had done surprisingly well. The old sting was there, but it was faint, like a half-forgotten scar. Her world of galas and aristocratic duties was so far removed from mine that we might as well have been living on different planets. I was content in my world of milk and mold, of honest work and tangible results. While my small business was thriving, a shadow was beginning to fall over the valley. It started subtly. A few vintners noticed an unusual yellowing on the leaves of their vines. A strange, sticky dust seemed to coat the grapes, stunting their growth. They were worried, but the Baron and his chief agronomist were dismissive. "It is just a weak strain of mildew," Baron von Hessler announced at a town meeting. A new fungicide from the capital will eradicate it. But it didn't. The blight, which the academics would later name Phylloxera viridea, was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was tenacious, virulent, and utterly devastating. The fungicides didn't touch it. Traditional methods of burning the affected vines only seemed to make the spores travel further on the wind. The first year, the harvest was down by 30%. The valley held its breath, praying it was a fluke. The second year, the harvest was down by 70%. The vibrant green hills began to look sick, patched with the brown and gray of dead and dying vines. The air itself seemed to change, losing the sweet, fruity scent of ripening grapes and taking on the sour, dusty smell of decay. Panic began to set in. Viridia's entire economy was a monoculture built on the grape. The wineries, the barrel makers, the pickers, the bottlers, the shippers, every family was connected to the wine trade, and most of them were dependent on the Hessler estate, the largest producer in the region. Layoffs began. Small, family-owned vineyards that had been passed down for generations went bankrupt. The market square grew quieter, the faces of my neighbors etched with fear and uncertainty. There was a grim, desperate energy in the air, the feeling of a world slowly coming to an end. My farm was an island in the midst of this creeping disaster. The blight didn't affect the wild grasses or the herbs. My goats, munching happily on their diverse diet, were healthier than ever. My business, insulated from the wine economy, continued to grow. In fact, it became a refuge. I hired people who had lost their jobs at the vineyards, teaching them the patient art of cheesemaking. I found that a vintner's sensitive palate, trained to detect subtle notes in wine, was excellent at detecting the nuances in aging cheese. Men and women who had spent their lives tending vines now found themselves tending my precious wheels of Viridian blue. I felt a heavy sense of responsibility. Their survival was becoming intertwined with mine. The turning point came from a completely unexpected direction. A food critic from a major national newspaper, a man named Clifford Kensington, traveled to Viridia. He had intended to write a somber, poetic piece about the death of a great wine region, a eulogy for the Hessler vintages. He spent a day walking through the blighted vineyards, speaking to the grim-faced vintners, gathering quotes for his tragedy. In the late afternoon, looking for a simple meal before heading back to the capital, he wandered into my little fromagerie, the Gilded Curd. He was a tall, elegant man, and he looked entirely out of place in my rustic shop. He looked around with a professional, slightly bored air. "I'll have whatever your local specialty is," he said, his voice weary. I didn't know who he was. I simply cut him a fresh slice of my Viridian blue. I served it to him with a piece of crusty bread and a slice of pear, the way I always did. He took a bite, and the boredom on his face vanished. It was replaced by shock, then intense concentration. He closed his eyes, savoring it. He took another bite, slower this time. He looked at me, his eyes wide with discovery. "What is this?" he breathed. "My God, what is this?" I spent the next hour telling him everything. About the goats, the unique pasture, the wild herbs, Gaspard's lessons, the cave. He furiously scribbled notes in a small, leather-bound book. He didn't write his tragic article about the death of Viridian wine. Instead, he wrote a triumphant feature about the birth of a new culinary masterpiece. The headline, printed in bold across the top of the lifestyle section, was "The King is Dead, Long Live the Queen, in the Ruins of Wine Country, a Blue Cheese Reigns Supreme." He didn't just call it cheese, he called it Viridia's blue gold. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. The day after the article was published, our phone began ringing and didn't stop. It was gourmet shops from the capital, five-star restaurants, international food importers. They all wanted one thing, my Viridian blue. The demand was staggering, a tidal wave I was completely unprepared for. I looked at Lena, my eyes wide with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Our little island was no longer a secret. The entire world was suddenly knocking at our door. We had a product the world wanted, and we were the only ones who could make it. In the heart of a dying valley, my humble, pitied business had just become the single flickering flame of hope. The valley's desperation had reached a fever pitch. The final government subsidies had run out, and the banks were beginning to foreclose on properties that had been in families for centuries. The mood was funereal. It was in this atmosphere of despair that Baron Friedrich von Hessler called an emergency council of the region's landowners and business leaders. For the first time in my life, I received a formal, hand-delivered invitation on thick Hessler stationery. My presence was requested. It was no longer a matter of courtesy. It was a matter of economics. I was now, officially, a player. I walked into the grand hall of the Hessler estate, the same hall where I had been humiliated at Isadora's wedding reception years ago. The marble floors gleamed just as they had then, but the mood was drastically different. The air, once filled with laughter and music, was thick with the silence of dread. The faces of the men and women gathered there, the same people who had offered me their pity for years, were gray with worry. I saw the Baron at the head of a long, polished table, looking older and smaller than I remembered. Isadora sat beside him, a statue of perfectly composed anxiety. Her jewels glittered, but they couldn't distract from the strained look in her eyes. When she saw me enter, her expression was a complex mixture of resentment, disbelief, and something else I couldn't quite name, a flicker of raw fear. I nodded to her politely, my heart beating a steady, calm rhythm, and took my designated seat. The Baron stood to address the assembly. He spoke of tradition, of heritage, of the centuries of winemaking that defined their identity. He then outlined a desperate, last-ditch plan. He proposed mortgaging all of their collective properties to the hilt to secure a massive federal loan. The money would be used to tear out the millions of dead vines and replant the entire valley with sugar beets for biofuel. He presented it as a bold step into the future, but everyone in the room could hear the truth behind his words. It was a gamble that would take a decade to pay off if it ever did. It would plunge them all into crippling debt and transform their beautiful valley into a soulless industrial farm. When he finished speaking, the silence was heavier than before. It was the silence of men and women looking into a grave. Into that void, I stood up. All eyes turned to me. I felt a tremor of nervousness, but I pushed it down. This was my moment. I wasn't the girl in the simple blue dress anymore. I was the president of the Gilded Curd, the valley's only profitable enterprise. "Baron," I began, my voice clear and steady, carrying easily in the silent hall. "Your plan asks us to destroy our identity and go into debt for a future we can't be sure of. I propose we invest in a future that has already begun." I didn't have charts or projections. I just spoke from the heart, with the simple logic of my own success. The world no longer wants Viridia's wine, but it is screaming for our cheese. The demand is more than I can possibly meet alone. I can't get enough milk. I don't have enough aging space. I don't have enough skilled hands. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the worried landowners. But all of that is right here, in this room. You have pastures, currently fallow, that could support herds of the finest dairy goats. Your stone wine cellars, sitting empty and useless, are perfect for aging cheese. Your people, who have lost their jobs, have the sensitive palates and patient hands needed for this craft. We have an established, world-renowned product. We have existing trade routes. We have everything we need. I paused, letting it sink in. I propose we form a cooperative, the Viridian Cheese Cooperative. We pool our resources, our land, our cellars, our people, and we meet this global demand together. We don't need a loan from the government. We need to invest in ourselves, in the one thing this valley produces that the blight cannot touch. A murmur went through the room. It started as a whisper and grew into a buzz of excited conversation. For the first time that day, there was a spark of hope in their eyes. They were looking at me, not with pity, but with a dawning sense of awe. The Baron was on his feet, his face purple with indignation. "This is absurd," he sputtered. "You expect us to trade centuries of noble winemaking heritage for goat farming, to turn our ancestral cellars over to your smelly cheese? The Hessler name is synonymous with fine wine, not livestock." Before I could respond, Isadora put a hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly firm. She was looking at the other landowners, seeing their faces, calculating the shift in power with the cold pragmatism I always knew she possessed. She saw that her husband had lost the room. He was clinging to a dead past, while I was offering a tangible future. The meeting broke up without a formal decision, but the tide had irrevocably turned. People crowded around me, asking questions, their voices filled with an eagerness that had been absent for years. I was about to leave when Isadora approached me. She had dismissed her husband and the remaining guests, and we were alone in the vast, echoing hall. She was stiff, her posture radiating a lifetime of aristocratic training, but her face was stripped of its usual haughty confidence. "Emma," she said, her voice low and formal. "Your proposal, it has merit." She had to force the words out. It was clearly painful for her. "The Baron is traditional, but the situation is dire. The estate is leveraged to its limit. We are facing ruin." She took a small, sharp breath, swallowing what was left of her pride. "We would be willing to partner with you, to invest the Hessler name, and what remains of our capital into this cooperative of yours, a joint venture." I looked at her, at this woman who had been my foil, my rival, my tormentor. I saw the fine lines of stress around her eyes. I saw the faint tremor in her hand. I thought of her words at the wedding, the casual cruelty of them. I had the power to destroy her, to refuse, to watch her and her arrogant husband lose everything. The temptation was a dark, sweet flicker in my soul. I could have my revenge. But as I looked at her, I realized I didn't want that kind of revenge. My vindication wasn't in her destruction. It was in my own success. My power didn't come from tearing her down, but from my ability to build something up. I gave her a calm, level look. "The Hessler name is no longer the most valuable brand in this region. Isadora," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "Mine is." Her eyes widened in shock. "This won't be a partnership of equals. There will be no joint venture. There is the cooperative. If you and the Baron want to save your estate, if you want to be a part of the future of this valley, you will join it. You will put your land and your cellars at its disposal, just like everyone else. You will work for it, on my terms." The color drained from her face. She looked at me as if I had physically struck her. The lowly cheesemaker she had pitied was now dictating the terms of her survival. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been completely, brutally inverted. She opened her mouth to say something, a protest, an insult, but no words came out. She just stood there, speechless, a whirlwind of fury, humiliation, and shock on her beautiful patrician face. I didn't wait for her response. I simply turned and walked away, my sensible boots making a quiet, solid sound on the cold marble floor. I left her standing alone in the cavernous hall of her crumbling legacy, the undisputed new queen of Viridia. The news of my ultimatum to the Baroness spread through the valley like wildfire. It became the stuff of legend overnight. The landowners, who had been teetering on the edge, saw it as a sign of strength and a clear path forward. Within a week, they had all pledged their allegiance and their resources. The Viridian Cheese Cooperative was officially born, and I was unanimously elected its president. The Baron and Isadora, facing total financial collapse and social irrelevance, had no choice. They sent word through their lawyer. They accepted my terms. Their capitulation was absolute. The first few months were a strange and delicate dance of new power dynamics. I set up our headquarters in the east wing of the Hessler estate, a practical decision as it was centrally located and had the largest administrative offices. Walking through those hallowed halls as the one in charge was a surreal experience. I insisted on paying a fair lease for the space, a business transaction that subtly underscored the new reality. They were no longer the patrons of the valley, they were its landlords. The true irony played out in the daily work. I assigned roles based on skill, not on former status. Baron Friedrich, a man who had never done a day of physical labor in his life, was surprisingly meticulous. His deep knowledge of the old trade routes and logistics, once used for shipping his fine wines, proved invaluable for establishing our international distribution network. I put him in charge of logistics. There was a particularly satisfying day when I walked into the old bottling plant, which we were converting into a packaging facility, and saw the Baron, in his shirt sleeves, arguing heatedly with a truck driver about pallet stacking regulations. He was good at it. He was useful. And he was my employee. Isadora's transformation was even more profound. Stripped of her role as the grand hostess and social arbiter, she seemed lost at first. But I remembered her ambition, her sharp mind. I also knew she spoke fluent French and Italian from her expensive finishing school education. I put her on the international sales and marketing team, reporting directly to Lena. Her first assignment was to translate our marketing materials and handle correspondence with buyers in Paris and Milan. At their first team meeting, I watched as she sat, pen poised over a notebook, while Lena, the woman who used to do accounts for a minor winery, laid out the quarterly sales strategy. Isadora took notes, her expression unreadable. She chafed under the authority of others, but she was a survivor. She did the work, and she did it well. She had a natural flair for the kind of diplomacy needed to woo high-end European clients. She was no longer selling her husband's heritage, she was selling my cheese. My own days were a whirlwind of activity. I oversaw the conversion of dozens of musty wine cellars into pristine, aging caves. I worked with agricultural experts to plan the rotation of new goat herds on former vineyard lands. I trained teams of new cheesemakers, sharing the secrets Gaspard had taught me. I was a creator, a teacher, and a leader, and I discovered I was good at all of it. I didn't rule with an iron fist. I listened, I collaborated, I empowered the very people who had once pitied me, and in doing so, I earned not just their respect, but their fierce loyalty. One evening, after a long day of meetings, I found myself walking to my old original cheese cave behind the now expanded farm. It was quiet and cool inside, the familiar earthy smell a balm to my soul. I ran my hand over the rough-hewn stone walls, the source of everything. I thought of the lonely, desperate girl who had cried in this cave, convinced she was a failure. I thought of the years of toil, the sting of humiliation, the quiet joy of that first perfect wheel of cheese. I hadn't set out to conquer the valley or to humble a baroness. I had simply wanted to create something beautiful and real, to make a life on my own terms. The revenge was just a byproduct, a consequence of me being stubbornly, unapologetically myself. In that quiet cave, I didn't feel triumphant or vindictive. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. I had built this, not just a business, but a future, and it was good. Several years passed. The valley of Viridia was reborn. The hills, once scarred with the brown skeletons of dead vines, were now lush and green, alive with the gentle bleating of goats. Tourists flocked to the region, not for wine tours, but for the Viridian cheese trail. They came to see the aging caves, to sample the famous blue gold at the Gilded Curd, and to marvel at the story of the valley's incredible transformation. The cooperative was a staggering success, the largest artisanal cheese exporter in the country. We had brought prosperity back, not just for a few landowners, but for everyone. The Hessler estate was now the permanent headquarters of the cooperative. Its grand ballroom was used for our annual shareholder meetings, and its manicured gardens were the site of the yearly Viridian Cheese Festival. Friedrich had settled into his role as logistics chief with a sort of grumpy competence. The fall had humbled him, stripping away his arrogance and leaving behind a man who simply took pride in a job well done. The most significant change was in Isadora. She had risen through the ranks, through sheer talent and hard work, to become my head of international sales. She traveled the world, an elegant and formidable ambassador for our brand. Our relationship had evolved into one of mutual professional respect. The old rivalry was a ghost, a story we no longer told. One afternoon, I found her on the loading docks behind the main house, overseeing a massive shipment destined for Japan. She was dressed in practical, tailored trousers and a crisp blouse, her hair tied back efficiently. She was pointing out something on a clipboard to a foreman, her tone sharp but fair. She looked happy, fulfilled in a way she never had when she was just the Baroness. She saw me and walked over, a file in her hand. "The Tokyo order is 10% larger than projected," she said, her voice all business. "We'll need to adjust the production schedule for the next quarter." "Good work," I said, meaning it. "We'll handle it." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the crates of cheese being loaded onto the refrigerated truck. The wheels were stamped with the cooperative's logo, a goat standing proudly atop a grape leaf. "I was a fool," she said suddenly, her voice quiet. She wasn't looking at me, but out at the bustling activity of the dock. All those years ago, I thought wealth and status were the only things that mattered. I measured everyone's worth, including my own, by the wrong things. She finally turned to look at me, her eyes clear and direct. I was cruel to you, and I am sorry. What you've done here, it's magnificent, Emma. Thank you for not letting me, and this whole valley, cling to the past. It wasn't a plea for friendship. It wasn't dramatic or tearful. It was a simple, honest acknowledgement from one powerful woman to another. It was the final closing of a circle that had begun with a cruel joke at a wedding reception. I held her gaze and gave her a small, genuine smile. We all did it, Isadora, I said. Together. I nodded once, accepting the apology and the new reality it represented. And with that, the last embers of the old bitterness finally turned to ash. Today, I look out over this valley, and I see a landscape of my own making. I am not a baroness. I don't have a title or a noble bloodline, but I am the most powerful woman in this district. My power isn't derived from who I married or how much I inherited. It was earned through dirt and sweat and way. It was built on a foundation of stubborn belief in a dream that everyone else called foolish. They pitied me for choosing the rustic path, but it was that very path that led not only to my salvation, but to theirs. The greatest lesson I learned is that your value is not a reflection in someone else's eyes. It is a fire you build within yourself. Sometimes, being underestimated is the greatest advantage you can have. It gives you the space to grow, to build, to create something so strong and true that when the world finally turns to look, you are already a fortress. I want to thank you all for listening to my story today. It's a piece of my heart that I'm sharing with you. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever turned something that others dismissed into your greatest strength? Share your story in the comments below. I read as many as I can, and I find so much inspiration in them. Don't forget to like this video if my journey resonated with you, and please subscribe to the channel for more stories of quiet strength and unexpected triumphs. Share this with someone who might need to hear that their foolish dream is worth fighting for. Thank you for being here with me. Remember to trust your own path, even if you're the only one walking it.